for your kind introduction. And I am really pleased to be here to give this keynote lecture. I want to thank Professor Rat Kantivar I hope I am pronouncing her name properly, for inviting me to give this lecture. So I'm really thankful to Shubhangi for this honor. And so I will now get started with the talk. And I want to thank all the participants to be here to attend this presentation, in spite of the fact that it is a little bit late in India, and also it is very early in the morning here in the United States. So let me get started, and I will now share the screen. So can everybody see my screen?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so if you are okay with the, you can see the screen and as well as the audio is okay, then I can get started. So as you can see here, that the talk that I am giving today, I decided to give this talk because I got the impression the for the host that I should consider something on the renewable energy and particularly the transition to net zero by moving from the current scenario of fossil fuels to the renewable energy. And this transition is not that simple or not that easy. It varies from country to country and from climate to climate. And so it is kind of very country specific, that what are the resources will be needed, how this transition will take place, and how much time period will be required to achieve the net zero. Of course, most of us have become very aware that the current scenario of having the fossil fuel, that means the coal, natural gas, oil, and for most of our energy needs, it means that we are basically combustion of these fuels results into carbon dioxide, methane, and other particulates. But most important of them is the carbon dioxide, because it resides in the atmosphere for several hundred years, in contrast to methane, which can reside for over a month or so. So it has become very important. And so this concentration is increasing in the atmosphere, and which is having an adverse effect on the climate. And so if this continues, then climate has a lot of impact on the day-to-day life that we are used to. And so as a result of that, it's become important to address that how do we mitigate the CO2, or at least try to arrest it for further emission into the atmosphere. So, but as I said, that this scenario of the current scenario of energy, which is being used worldwide, is very different from one country to the other, and in which the more affluent nations, which are primarily the Western nations, have plays a very different role than the other nations, like in particular India, which have come to change the situation. But there's a more difficult situation because our population is large, and as well as the energy transition requires a tremendous amount of investment and money, and we don't have that even as infrastructure. But I think India is also making a lot of progress. So given that brief introduction, I will now start with the presentation. So this idea is not old, that that the world is not addressing the current situation. It goes back to at least in the literature, to about 1990s, when the former uh, Director General of World Health Organization, and also the Prime Minister of Norway, Gro Harlem Brundtland, she headed up a task force, and in that, the conclusion was made that we are the world should look at the sustainable development. It is very important in order to preserve the earth for our children and grandchildren the way we have found it. So we were consuming the resources at a faster rate, and of course the population is increasing as well. And along with that, that was impacting the economic development, and it was also impacting the environment. So, in particular, the environment impact was going to be substantial because, again, the modern life primarily depends on how much energy is being consumed. So, as a result of that, that report was issued in 1987, and that became the Brundtland Report, and that is the one that became a basis of further discussion, particularly in United Nations and among other countries. But it took a long while, actually, that at least about another 25 to 30 years, because to get the government leaders, the industry leaders, as well as the general public to get aware of that there is a serious problem which is affecting the climate change because of the combustion of the fossil fuels. So in that context, the sustainability is now, of course, a very well-known term that is being used in context of almost everything. They talk about, sustainable food, sustainable energy, sustainable education, you can name it. The sustainability has become almost a common jargon in our everyday discussions, whether we are in academia or industry or government or even our everyday life. And so this definition, there are a large number of definitions you can find. You can Google it and you will find that number of people have defined it differently. But I like this particular definition, which was put together in 2006 by the President Emeritus of Cornell University. And he said that the effort to frame social and economic policy so as to preserve Earth's bounty, its resources, inhabitants, and environments for the benefit of both the present and the future generations. So that was the main essence of the Brundtland Report as well, that not only the present, but we have to preserve the earth as we inherited it for the future generations. So in the present context of this lecture, the emphasis is more on the environment and the impact on the environment, and that is, of course, affected by the usage of energy. So if you look at the population and consumption statistics that has occurred in the last 50 years, the population has doubled, the food consumption has tripled, and fossil fuel consumption has quadrupled, and energy consumption has more than quadrupled. So you can see that this is the situation in the year from 50 to 2000, and from 2000 to 2025, this trend has been increasing even much more exponentially than in the past. And the population is still increasing, food consumption is increasing, and of course, one of the reasons is that the expectation of the people everywhere in the world has, with natural reasons, has increased. So everybody is looking for a better living conditions, better opportunity for their children. And so as a result of that, everything is based on the energy consumption and all these other criteria. So as a result of that, these statistics is on the rise, and as a result of that, the consumption of energy is also increasing. So now if you look at this trend, and it is of course already estimate that by 2050, the population of the world will become about 9 billion. And so it could be 8.5 billion or 9 billion. And at that point, it will stabilize. And so currently the population is increasing. And of course, the population now in India is also increasing. India has a very young population compared to many other countries, like, for example, China. And also it has already surpassed the population of China with about 1.5 billion people. So our energy scenario and our attempt to achieve the net zero by 2070 or 2080 is a lot more different than many other countries. So these are the sustainable goals that have been articulated by United Nations, and they keep on changing. So these are 17 sustainable goals, or they are also called the Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs. And you can see that many of these goals, no poverty, zero hunger, good health, quality education, gender equality, clean water and sanitation, affordable and clean energy, and work environment, etc. You can go on these, and you can find that most of them have to deal with our current situation in the environment, and how do we improve these situations so that not only a few, but almost everybody has access to some of these basics which are needed for having a reasonably good quality of life, not only for themselves, but for their children. So this topic has been known. So the 17 goals, they were actually started with number 10. And now, of course, they have keep on increasing, and by including, a lot of other aspects which are also important in the context of, how do we improve our life. And also, how do we make sure that, all the necessities that are needed for a sustainable life on Earth is available. So this is a summary of some of those main topics. The water, we know, is a very important area because it is getting scarce. Food is, of course, important. Health and education. And we want to eliminate poverty because a large segment of population is still in Asia and also in Africa is facing, actually subhuman level poverty. And of course, environment is very, very important. We want to have a nice and clean environment, and security also becomes important, because if the lack of all the above can lead to violence, and the violence becomes sometimes non-manageable for the governments and the people. So all these issues are very important. And our focus is also, of course, on environment, but they are all related. There is a nexus. There's a food, water, energy, and environment. All these four form a nexus. So they are basically coupled each other. And of course, the other nexus is the security and also the economic freedom. So they are all together. So this is a triangle which shows actually the energy and sustainability, and how do we go about the sustainable development. So for sustainable development, we have to have, three aspects that must be addressed. And then is, of course, the economy, because economy, if it is not strong, then, of course, as I mentioned, it can lead to violence and other problems and instability in the nations. And then, of course, environment is very important because it is also related to economy and also the stability and security. So this is basically, I already talked about in the previous slide. Of course, why energy is important is that the Human Development Index, which is a way that the United Nations characterizes that how well a particular nation is doing. So you can see that it is directly related to the per capita consumption of electricity, or say electricity is, of course, generated by some kind of a source of energy source. So you can see here, and this is a little bit of a relatively older slide, but you can see that the energy that is being used for affluent nations, the United States, and then you can see the European nations, and is much, much larger than if you go back to the China, and if you see that India, the energy consumption is very, very small, although it's increasing, but relatively it is minuscule compared to the energy that is being used by the affluent nations. And as a result of that, they are also very much responsible for having large emissions of the greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide. So again, it is also related to the GDP. The energy consumption is directly related to the affluence as well as GDP. And you can again see the same chart, which was shown in the previous slide as a Human Development Index, that the GDP is of, for example, relatively less affluent nations or poorer nations. You can see Bangladesh at the bottom, and then you can find there China is somewhere in the middle, but is slightly, at a higher place now than in this chart. And of course, the affluent countries, are the United States and some of the Asian countries also, like Japan, South Korea, and so on. So the bottom line is that the well-being of the people and the alleviation of poverty, etc., is directly related to energy consumption. Because everything that we do is required some form of the energy. So now if you look at on these charts, give you some kind of a qualitative picture that how the energy is being consumed by various nations by up to the extrapolation of up to 2050. And what you find is that the red curve now is that of China, which means that, of course, China, we can know that there's a tremendous growth in the energy consumption. And if it keeps on going, because their GDP is increasing and their energy consumption is increasing because of the affluence, they are going to have this exponential growth that is being shown by red. Now, India has been behind, but really also is experiencing a large growth in terms of the consumption of energy. So you can see that the GDP and as well as the energy, they are basically related, which I showed you in the previous slide. And this slide clearly shows that the GDP of India is increasing, China is increasing, China is growing a little faster, and many other countries also, like in South America or Latin America. And of course, if you look at the other countries which are shown here, which are basically European countries, etc., you will find that the consumption is the GDP is relatively less, but because their population is small. I mean, India has 1.5 billion people, and the Germany has about 80 million people. So all the European countries have very small population, including Japan. So that's why you don't see that much higher growth. But if the blue line is, of course, United States, with a population of 350 million, and again you can see that there is a growth which is taking place in terms of the GDP. But you can already see that by 2040, the China is going to surpass the GDP of United States and will become the world's #1 economy, and followed by United States. And India may not be that much behind. The forecast is that India right now is the 5th largest economy, and it might become like a 3rd largest economy. And in order to experience this growth, and which means that to uplift the people from poverty and provide them more opportunities for this generation and future generations, it becomes important that the energy, and these are all will require a lot more energy consumption as the GDP grows. So now you can see the world market energy consumption by the region, and you can see the developing countries are shown in the green line, and also the industrialized countries, that is the Western countries, including the United States, are shown by the blue line. And then, of course, we have the Eastern European countries, including the Russia and former Soviet Union countries. So you can see that the energy consumption that is going to take place is primarily going to be in the developing countries, and that is where it basically includes China and India, because together they are about 3 billion people. And the rest of the countries like in Africa, etc., they are also included, but their overall consumption is going to be much smaller because of the population, relative population. So how are the energies being used? So you can see the sources of energy, that is oil, coal, natural gas, and these are all combustible form of energy, biomass. Now, biomass is used quite a bit, which is again a consumption, a carbon neutral, is not the renewable in that sense, but is a carbon neutral form of energy that is, again, a combustible form of energy. And it can, again, of course, gives rise to CO2 emissions. But on the other hand, the CO2 is absorbed in the growing of the biomass. So that in that sense, it is called a carbon neutral form of energy. But oil and coal and natural gas and others, they are really the largest emitter of CO2 and other greenhouse gases. But CO2 is the one that are most concerned, and you can say nuclear and hydropower. And then everything else is combined together in a very small, minuscule way, and that is the renewable energy. So even right now, the situation is that the fossil fuel are the one which are driving most of the world in terms of meeting the energy needs. And that includes, energy needs not only for the homes, the buildings, but also the transportation. And transportation has a very peculiar emission scenario compared to the other parts of the energy usage, that is homes, industries, and so on. And I will mention that in a moment. Now, how the energy is being used, you can see that for domestic use, commercial use, electricity that we use for our buildings, the industry that uses the industry like steel or cement, which are really large consumer of energy, and the other industry, but also they are a large emitter of CO2. And then, of course, power and heat generation and transport is also a major sector. Now, the difference in the emissions that the transport sector emits versus the rest of the sectors, which is a big difference, and that is that the rest of the places, like is an electric power plant or is industry, the emissions are concentrated in that particular area. So there is a way that the CO2 emission is taking place from electric power plant. You can capture the CO2 and maybe figure out another way, either you to convert into chemicals or you can sequester it under the ground. But if you have a transportation like a car or a aeroplane or any other kind of transportation, the emission is mobile. So as the car is moving, the emission is moving. As the airplane is moving, emission is moving. So to capture and then arrest that emission is extremely hard. So transportation sector is very challenging, and that is why the only solution is to going from the fossil fuel based cars, like driven by a gasoline, you have to go to electric vehicles. So that is why there is so much a push to go to electric vehicle, because the electric generation in an electric power plant, you can control the emissions, or not control the emissions, but you can arrest the emissions. And then there is a way to capture that CO2, and then either you sequester it underground or you can form into a usable chemicals. So there's a big difference in the transportation sector and all other sectors of energy consumption which are emitting the CO2 because they are fixed place. So their solutions that is needed is very different. So now I'm going to talk very quickly and not spend too much time. That is how the energy is being used in the United States, and that is the energy consumption by various sectors. And you can see here that the renewables is shown in the green. So you can see the renewables is a very small part. And mostly you can see here is the blue, which is a coal, and then you can see the petroleum and nuclear, which is a blue part, but the green part is very, very small. So if you look at the transportation sector, there is no green at all, because we really do not know how to use the renewables for the transportation. The only way we can do it is indirectly, and which I alluded to a minute ago, and that is that you can generate electricity and then you can use the electric vehicles. Or electric vehicles, you have to then you have to use the batteries, or you have to use the fuel cell, or whatever mechanism it may be. And then, of course, you have to recharge all of them. So basically, you are using electricity, and that means as an indirect way of basically helping the transportation sector. And otherwise, there is no direct way to use the renewables like wind, solar, biomass, or any other in the transportation sector. So if you look at the energy consumption by fuel types, then you can see that still the oil is the largest one, and because of the reason being the transportation sector and also some industrial sector use it, and then the natural gas and coal, they are followed by that. They are highly used. So these are all fossil fuels, and then renewables and nuclear are much smaller. Now, nuclear is not really energy which is a clean energy source, but there's some questions about it, because it can be used for creating non energy applications, and so that is not acceptable. And also, if there is a nuclear power plant disaster takes place, it can have a tremendous impact on for hundreds of years, because of the radioactive material that can come out of such a disaster. So now you can see, and I'm not going to go in detail, that the oil reserves by country, we all know that Saudi Arabia, Canada, And it turns out that now United States also has recently discovered a lot more oil. So it has also become as much oil producing nations as the Middle Eastern countries like UAE and very close to Saudi Arabia. But if you can see in this list that India is not mentioned anywhere at all. And the reason is that in India, the oil production is very little, almost negligible, to be on this particular chart. So the rest of the world is the one that includes India, and you can see that the oil reserve is very limited. The hardly much oil is available, and so as a result of that, we are dependent on the Middle East or Russia or some other country to meet our oil needs, and oil is needed for transportation. And now, if you go to natural gas, then you can again see that natural gas development here. The again Middle East and United States and many other countries have a lot more natural gas, and again India is not endowed that much with the natural gas. You go to the coal, then you can see the India is there, and it is the coal is shown in completely black. So there are two type of coals: subbituminous coal and the bituminous coal. And the India has a bituminous coal, which is not really again a very desirable type of coal, because the CO2 emissions from this, it is called a dirty coal actually. And so, and the bluish one is a more not coal is always dirty, but it's a little more cleaner. So India has a lot of coal to meet its energy needs for several hundred years to come. But again, that how to use that energy and still make sure that it can be somehow come under the category of clean energy uh, by doing something to the CO2 emitted in an electric power plant, for example. So the forecast is in spite of the fact that there's so much fossil fuel available in the world overall, which I showed you in the previous chart for the natural gas and for the coal and the oil. There are three main type of resources for the fossil fuel, which are being used even today. It turns out that anything is finite. So if you take the estimates, and even if some new reserves are being discovered, it turns out that there is only a supply of not more than 100 to 200 years. Coal may last for a longer period, but the natural gas and also the oil, may not last for much longer. So also there is a need to find an alternative way to of energy, even if we are not that much bothered about that we are using the fossil fuels. So now, what is the consequence of using the fossil fuels? We all know that it is affecting the climate change, and of course, there was an influence on the ozone reduction, and that problem is now a little bit under control. And of course, global warming is a consequence again of the global greenhouse gas emissions. So they are all coupled in a way together. All three are not separate; they each affect each other. The climate change is a long-term problem. Global warming is a relatively short-term problem. So if you look at the emissions, this is a good chart. So it is shown here until 2030. And so again, you can see that the emissions that are being produced by the more affluent countries are in the red color. And then the transitional economies, that is the one like Russia and other East European countries. And the developing countries, the emissions are increasing. And the two countries that are considered primarily responsible is the China and India. And so right now, it's the United States is the number one emitter, and followed by China is number second, very close second, and the third one is India, which is actually way not that close to China, but is still number three in terms of the total emissions. So the effect of these emissions, which everybody knows by now, is that it increases the temperatures, the average temperature of the surface of the Earth. And as a result of that, there is what is called the effect of global warming. And that is of main concern, and that we know can give rise to increase in the sea levels and fires and what they call is extreme weather events, and which are being seen around the world. For example, the last time, a few years ago, there was big floods in Pakistan, which resulted in about more than $30 billion of loss and economic loss, and along with that, of course, the loss in property and loss in the lives. And so that was basically attributed to the extreme weather event. So you can see that if you look at this chart going back to 1860 and all the way to current 2030, the temperatures keep on increasing. And so although it appears that there's a small increase, but that is a significant increase. So for example, if we leave the business as usual scenario right now and don't make any drastic changes in terms of the transition from the fossil fuel to the renewable energy, the temperatures of the global surface temperature, that is the average in 2100, is forecast to be about 4 degrees centigrade, and that will create havoc, in many aspects um, of the natural habitats that we are used to it. And so, as a result of that, the analysis tells that it should not increase more than 2 degrees centigrade. And how do we achieve it? Is the one that people are trying to struggle. And there are many IPCC and COP conferences are taking place. So this shows that there are three main emitters, which are global greenhouse gases, but the most important one is the carbon dioxide, because it resides in the atmosphere for a very long time, maybe a couple of 100 years. And then the methane is there, which also affects the climate, but it is not as big a culprit as the carbon dioxide. So again, you can see, if you look at the right-hand side of the graph, that as the going back to 1000 to year 2000, there has been a sudden rise into the concentration of these gases into the atmosphere in last about 50 years or so. And this is again a very chart which basically shows in part per million. So it turns out that currently the CO2, like which is measured in part per million, was close to about 380 about 20 years ago, but now it is close to about 400 currently in 2023. So you can see that it still keep on increasing. And of course, methane is much smaller. It is in part per billion, but it's nevertheless, it is also a matter of concern. And similarly, nitrous oxide is in part per billion. And so these are the ones that, are not major concern in terms of the effect on the atmosphere, but the CO2 is in part per million, which is a big concentration, and it is keep on increasing. Currently, it is close to about 400 parts per million. So what is the current global energy consumption right now? It is about 19.6 terawatt, and that consists of oil, gas, coal, solar, and biomass, wind, and nuclear. So you can see that basically oil, gas, and coal, which are on the left-hand side, are the major consumption even today in 2023. And then, of course, solar is increasing, but biomass is being used a great deal, because in a lot of parts of the world, biomass is used for cooking, heating, and so on, because the other sources of energy are not easily available. So even in parts of India and also a lot of places in Africa and other parts of the world, in Latin America and so on, the biomass is used significantly. And so now 2050 forecast is that we will need about 27.6 terawatt of energy, and the biomass share will increase unless until there is some other change takes place and the people have the availability of other kind of renewable energy, which doesn't look like a very promising scenario right now for many countries because of the investment that is required in infrastructure. So this is an interesting chart that shows the global emissions by countries. And so you can see, and this is based on 2016 figures. So I have shown that number 1, 2, and 3 are China, USA, and India, and how much tons of CO2 emissions is taking place, and what is the change in 1 year. And so you can see that there is now, there has been an attempt to basically reduce the CO2 emission by a very small percentage. So China is trying to reduce it, US is trying to reduce it, India is still not able to reduce it. Then you can see the other countries. And then at the bottom, I'm showing you Pakistan and Bangladesh. So this list is actually put together by the United Nations, and there are over 200 countries. But I just highlighted, the one that are of more interest to us. And you can see here, that's an important thing to recognize on the right-hand side. Column, it shows that the per capita emission, because India has a large population, China has a large population, so per capita emission is much smaller than United States. United States has 350 million people, and India has 1.5 billion people. So India per capita is 1.89. So India always makes a case, and rightly so, that our per capita emission is much, much smaller than many other countries that I have listed here. You can see Russia, Japan, Germany, etc. Because of the small population, their per capita emission is much, much larger than India. But India is always, pointed out as a culprit because they say that the total emission in India is larger. So there is a dichotomy here that if you calculate it on per capita basis, then you will find that India is much lower than many other countries that I have listed here, including UK. And you can see here the Pakistan and of course Bangladesh are even lower. Now, if you look at the share of the world, the China is about 29.18%, USA is 14%, and India is still about 7%. So in that sense, India is not actually as much of a polluter of the world's atmosphere on a per capita basis as the other countries, but we are all in together here. So India is also making tremendous efforts to reduce the emissions in order that the coming generations we have a much better scenario for the climate, and also avoiding the events, the extreme weather events. So some of you may be aware that there was a United Nations conference, COP27, which was held in Egypt about 2 years ago. The reason I put this slide in is that there was a lot of discussion about the situation, and particularly the climate minister became actually very well known in the community, and maybe you people in India have also heard about it. Her name is Sherry Rahman from Pakistan, and she made a very persuasive argument to the Western nations to contribute to the development of infrastructure that can allow the transition from the fossil fuels to the renewables, because it will require a tremendous amount of investment, because all these countries are relatively, not that affluent and relatively poor, and they cannot afford to transition, without investment. And so made a persuasive case. But, and a lot of the Western countries which were there, including the United States, which was represented by John Kerry, who was a climate czar at the United States, and they said that it will require at least $500 billion to $1 trillion to in next 20 years to at least make a dent into the infrastructure of many of these countries. But it turns out that, of course, there was a kind of low-key reception to this idea. Nobody totally opposed it, but the final, proof comes in when the people are willing to put the money on the table, and it hasn't happened. So whether this will occur or not, we don't know. But this idea is now getting more and more potency and much more, force, and various meetings of United Nations and the world forums, World Economic Forums and others, where there is a push that the wealthier nations should put in a relatively larger amount of money in order to make it possible to for the poorer nations or relatively less affluent nations to be able to transition from the current fossil-based economies to the renewable energy-based economies. So how do we, address the current situation for sustainable energy? Now, some things we can do very easily without actually having a major change in the infrastructure. And so there should be a multifold strategy, and one of them is a conservation. So conservation means that minimize the wastage. So in a lot of places, particularly I know in the United States, we waste a tremendous amount of energy. Now you have these big houses, which really, people don't use the energy effectively, because buildings are a very major consumption of energy sources. And so, like, for example, you have the HVAC systems for heating and cooling. You have all these appliances, including for cooking and dishwasher and for clothing and so on. And then you have, of course, the electricity usage. Uh, so all these things together, there's a lot of wastage. Even if you leave the light bulb on, and also you're using an inefficient light bulb, it can make a tremendous difference that how do you use the energy. So conservation can be practiced in all parts of the world, and it doesn't cost anything except you have to make the people aware of that this is very important. Of course, if you don't have money to pay for the energy usage, you will naturally conserve. Because I know that when I was growing up in India, we used to be very conscious about conserving the energy by not wasting it. And so if you are not using the light bulb, then you basically turn it off. So, and the other one is the efficiency. So a lot of things that we have, and this is true particularly of the relatively less affluent countries, that our infrastructure is also very poor in the sense that it requires a tremendous improvement. So the infrastructure is such that is a tremendous amount of wastage of energy. Even the power plants are not that efficient as they should be. And also the appliances that we use in everyday life, so everything is not that efficient. So as a result of that energy efficiency in all aspects of the appliances, in the home area, in the industry, the industrial equipment that we use, they are all 30, 40, 50 years old. And to replace them, it requires an investment. But on the other hand, that is needed to have much more energy efficient scenario. And so the renewable energy is one of the, of course, area that, the focus of this talk is, and we are all aware of it, that how do we have newer sources of clean and cheaper energy which are renewable. And that is, they basically have less emission or almost no emission. So these multiple strategy, the number 1 and 2, I think it can be easily practiced if the attempt is made. But for that, the public has to become aware and conscious about this, including the industrial leaders, that this is important, where they are still using very, very old equipment. And so what are the sustainable energy sources? And they are the ones that are basically renewable. So those are the ones that are going to be the most sustainable energy sources. Now, what is the global vision? If you look at that in terawatt hours per year from 1990 to 2050, you can see that the nuclear is, the yellow is very small. I think that people are not going to accept the new nuclear plant. And you can see here the fossil fuel is in the blue, and then that fossil fuel, the wind is in blue, and then we have a small amount of hydro, which is a dark blue, and then we have a fossil fuel, and then solar. So the idea is that the fossil fuel, which is shown in the white, is the one that we should try to phase out by 2030 or 2040 time frame, and go to primarily to wind and solar, And hydropower is all maxed out. There is very little scope to increase the hydropower. And of course, there is no interest in the nuclear. So basically, what I'm showing you here is that the solar power will increase. And I think that it is thrust in India and China and many other countries of Africa to go with the solar PV to transition. And of course, wind is also possible. Some countries, particularly in Europe, like Scandinavian countries and many others, are more endowed with wind. In India, there is some wind farms in Gujarat and Tamil Nadu and only a few places, but we do not have places where we have class 6 wind. So if you look at the wind classification, you need to have at least class 6 wind. And in India, we have about, mostly class 3, and which is like, about 5 meters per second. So you really cannot extract too much energy in a cost effective manner. And so the energy sources, and this is very important. So if you look on the top, you have biomass and ocean, solar, photovoltaic, wind, hydro, waves, and so on. And then you have here in the bottom, you can see that we have geothermal, fission and fusion. So all kind of things are listed. So how the energy from all these sources is going to be taken out and converted into a usable form. So that also is a very challenging thing in terms of the amount of investment that is required. You can say, yes, we have abundance of solar in India. How do you take that solar and convert it into a electricity or usable, heat form? So that is a challenge because it will require some kind of equipment. Similarly, you can take solar energy, which of course result into wind or hydro wave or some kind of a wave energy or ocean energy. How do you take that and then convert into a usable form? So usable form means a mechanical energy form, or it can be an electrical energy form, or it's a chemical energy form, some form or the other which is usable. So that is where the investment is needed to make that happen. So knowing that we have all this and all these things exist is not enough. The challenge is how do we make this transition, and what are the requirement, what is the equipment that is needed, what is the investment that is needed. And it's not going to have overnight. What is the plan? The planning is needed in order for that to happen. And so renewable energy sources, I've already mentioned. So the solar derived sources, solar, thermal, photovoltaic, wind, biomass, hydropower, wave energy, ocean. And of course, non-solar renewable energy is the tidal energy and geothermal energy and renewable hydrogen. So I understand that India is really putting a lot of effort in generating the renewable hydrogen part of the energy. And so it turns out that if you look at the cost, which is very important because ultimately the consumer has to pay for this cost. So it turns out that the cost is going down slowly, and like wind energy and the solar PV, etc., it has become much lower than what it used to be. And so now wind energy potential is a tremendous wind energy potential all around the world. And so it can be tapped. It is about 50 terawatt is available. And so it can basically take care of the entire need of 25 terawatt, which we need by 2050. But it turns out that the class 3 land area will provide only 2 terawatt. And so in India, we have primarily the class 3 wind. And so as a result of that, India doesn't have too much of wind energy potential except limited. So as you can see, the wind energy cost is going down as you go back from 1980 to 2020. And in the United States, it's about 4 cents per kilowatt hour. Similarly, solar energy, there's enough solar radiation available, particularly in the tropics and some other parts of the world, including India, that you can harness it. And if you look at it, there's tremendous amount of solar power, even with a very poor efficiency of conversion to about 10 to 15% is possible that we can meet all the needs of the entire world. But again, this is easy said on the paper, but in practice it's not that easy. So the solar, of course, energy, you can convert it by solar thermal or the solar photovoltaic. Solar photovoltaic is actually getting a lot of traction. And again, China has become a leader in creating the solar panels and at a relatively effective cost. The solar thermal energy systems that are available, but they are quite expensive actually, and but they have a lot of positive aspect, particularly in the climates like that the India has in a lot of parts of Africa. But I think everybody is going to, and again, its cost is coming down. But the photovoltaic is the one in which the new materials are being developed, particularly nanoscale materials. And as a result of that, as you can see in this chart, the major concern was the cost and the efficiency. So now we are in the area of number 3, which is a orange color in this chart. So as the materials are developing, then it turns out that the cost is coming down and the efficiency is going up. So that is a very good news for the solar photovoltaic. And that is the reason that most of the countries in the world which are where the solar energy is more easily, naturally available, are going with this route. There are some issues with the solar panels, and particularly in terms of their life cycle and longevity, etc. But I think that they are being worked at, and eventually it will come down. And again, you can see that wind energy, solar thermal, solar photovoltaic, they're all there. Prices are coming down to the level that they are become effective. So the other one is biomass, and biomass is still being used quite a great deal in a lot of parts of the world. And the reason being that it is easily available. And so, when I was growing up in India, a lot of people in the surrounding villages, even the children, they did their whole day job was to collect the biomass, and the ladies' whole day job was to really, get the water. And because they are the basic things needed for survival. So you need for cooking, you need for the water for drinking, and so you need for basics are needed, and so that was very important. So in a large part of the world, still people spend a lot of time in collecting the biomass to meet their basic needs for cooking and heating. And it is considered renewable, which is kind of a not same sense that renewable like wind or solar. In this case, it is a combustible product, just like oil and natural gas, but it is different than you basically combust a wood, for example, or a biomass, and then of course you will emit the CO2. But the argument is that CO2 is needed for the photosynthesis that is required for the generation of the biomass. And so as a result of that, it is called a carbon neutral source of energy. And so there is again a limitation on the amount of biomass that you can generate, because you cannot compete with the biomass that is needed for human consumption as a food, or even for animal consumption. So this is a chart that was put together, many years ago by an actually Nobel laureate, Stephen Chu, at the Lawrence Livermore National Lab. And he basically said that there is a total of 13 billion hectares that is available on the earth. And there is a non-arable, the other crops, the forests and savannas, pasture and range, and cereal. So the amount of biomass that is available is going to be limited. And so it cannot meet all the needs that we have. So it can be just a part of the energy. So there was this estimate that was made that, what is feasible. So it seems that if we want to generate 27.5 terawatt that is needed in 2050, you will require about 42% of the total land area of the earth, which is absolutely not feasible. So people talk a lot about biomass, but they really do not know what is the feasibility of having biomass, which doesn't compete with the food crops. And similarly, if you look at the bottom-up scenario, then again the same problem occurs, that the total amount of biomass that is land that is available is for 9 billion people, for their living in buildings and all other things is going to be a very large amount of area. And so the amount of biomass area that is available is again going to be so large that to meet the energy needs that it is just not doable. So it can be a small mix, but there are some countries like, for example, Brazil and United States that have a huge land area, and so they can generate like sugarcane and many other type of biomass, and then can generate biodiesel or particularly bioethanol. That Brazil is big in it, and some parts of the Europe also can generate biodiesel. But again, it may not be a solution to meet a large amount of energy needs for a country like India. So there are biomass types which we are all aware of, which can generate bioethanol, and there are others that can generate like biodiesel, like oil, trees, and algae. So people are using it, and then of course there are other biomasses which are available in any country, like agricultural residues, forestry, livestock residues, which are not recommended because that can have some health effects. Then special energy crops, and then of course the solid waste. And so some of them I think are generated as a matter of everyday life, and so they can be used. So biomass then of course has its own chemical characteristics. A lot of it is cellulose, hemicellulose, and lignin. So in each of these areas that I'm presenting, actually one can have a complete lecture. And so I think that I don't have time, but then from biomass, primarily it is being used. If it is not directly used by the people for cooking and heating in winter, then they is primarily used for generation of ethanol and as well as the biodiesel. But it turns out that these processes are very kind of chemically intensive. I mean, you need all kind of catalysts and all that to do that, and so they have to be competitive again with the oil. Otherwise, people will not buy them. So you cannot have, and also they require change in the engines and so on. So there are a lot of issues involved. But 10% ethanol is being used in terms of the biomass in order to have at least some impact. And so, as I mentioned to you, the biodiesel and bioethanol, they both have the problems that they will emit the emissions of CO2, but they are kind of carbon neutral. Hydropower, of course, we all are very familiar with. This has peaked out. This is a completely clean form of energy, and there are very little hydropower that can be generated uh, from most of the part of the world. Wave energy, it is possible that we have ocean waves that have energy in it, but the extraction of that wave energy is extremely expensive, and so it is not economically competitive. So this shows where the wave energy is available. So like in coastal area of India, which is shown here, there is potential for wave energy on both in the Arab Sea and also in the Bay of Bengal, but it turns out that it is not really economical. Ocean energy, again, these are all the places, the energy is available, but again, they are not very competitive. Similarly, ocean, you have a temperature change as you go under from the surface towards the deeper part of the ocean, and so you can harness the temperature change and maybe get energy. But these are all pie in the sky kind of things. Now, geothermal energy has a lot of potential, but not as much potential in India as you can see. It has a lot of potential. Like, for example, Iceland, about 40 to 50% of energy comes from the geothermal sources. And in the part of United States and part of other parts of the world, which are shown here in the red, uh, geothermal energy has a good potential. So these are various sources of geothermal energy, including the actually lava, but these are all again pie in the sky and just not suggesting that can happen. Now, tidal energy is really a potentially a good source of energy, but again, they are very expensive. and it has been tried, and there are tidal energy plants, very well known, are in for example in France and other places, and so one can discuss this, but again these are not the solutions. And of course, one of the things that I mentioned to you in the early on, and that is what is called the clean coal. So clean coal doesn't mean that the coal is clean, but it means that if the power is generated from the coal, like an electric power plant, it is a fixed place from where the CO2 emissions are coming out of the, for example, power plant chimney. And from there, you can capture that, and that is what is called the carbon capture and sequestration, so CCS. So it has become a big technology area in many parts of the world, but particularly China is looking at it very seriously, and India actually started only recently. As a matter of fact, just about 2 months ago, I had a student whom I was co-advising at MNNIT Allahabad, and his name was Abhishek Gupta. So he did a thesis in the carbon capture and sequestration, considering the Kaveri Basin in India, for the sequestration of the carbon emitted from the power plants in close to that area. And so he did a good thesis. So in India, it is now catching on, but I think it is still way behind China and other countries. So this is, just a schematic of that. And it is competitive. But on the other hand, since you have to sequester it, it turns out that it is not that competitive the uh, in terms of the total cost. But there is an increase in the cost by about uh, I would say 25% by taking and capturing the CO2 and then sequestering it underground. The technology is there, but it is expensive to do that. So I think that that is a real problem. So all the things are possible, but there has to be an investment. So there are fixed sources of emissions where it is possible to capture the CO2, whether it's from an industrial plant or it is from an electricity generation plant, and then you can either use it for the creation of products or new chemicals, or you can sequester it under the ground. And so these are possibilities, but again, all these things are expensive. So nuclear energy, I'm not going to touch upon. Nuclear proliferation, nuclear waste, and many other things are becoming a major concern. So it is not getting much traction in any part of the world. So in the United States, the scenario is that it is a mix of all type of energy. That is a biomass, geothermal, solar plant, wind, and so on, that can provide a pathway in transition from the fossil fuels, that is oil, gas, and coal, towards these possibilities. And there is a pathway of transition. But the United States is endowed with a couple of things which other countries don't. First of all, over a couple of centuries, it has become quite well off and fairly one of the richest countries in the world. And so they have the money to make this transition feasible. And they have the resources to make it feasible. The second thing is that resources are available also. That is geothermal resources, the biomass resources, the wind, and the other resources are available. And the population is only 350 million as of a few months ago. So all the things are endowed, and it is relatively a very secure country in terms of the security issues. So as a result of that, they can make this transition more easily. So now I want to spend, about 10 minutes, because I think my time may be running out, is on the energy transition in India. So I will completely focus on the current scenario, that what is happening in India and where it is going. So I gave you a overall view of what are the issues in terms of the worldwide, the energy scenario, but with a major focus on the United States. But also, what is the situation in terms of what are the issues in terms of the transition from, say, fossil fuel to excuse me, to the renewables. So energy transition in India is a little more problematic because of the big population, aging infrastructure, and also, only recently the government is putting a lot of effort in making it possible. So one of the things that they are trying to do is to integrate the digital technology into the energy system. So I think that since, we are going to take a leap forward rather than, so it is not necessary that we follow the path that other countries in Europe and United States and Japan followed it, because we can leap forward by digitizing the energy transfer system so that it is a lot more efficient, a lot more effective, because I told you the efficiency is extremely important in these systems. The other thing is that we have to basically let the population know about the importance of the energy conservation. And I think a lot of people already know because of the cost considerations, but other than that, it's still, I think that people should become more aware of that. It is very important to address the energy conservation. And of course, these are the government considerations that they should establish and enforce the rules and regulations on the industry so that they also are motivated towards the more energy carbon-free environment. Because unless until there is an incentive to the industry, they are unlikely to invest into the new equipment and also invest into technologies that can make them carbon-free. So there can be a carbon tax or many other ways. So the last bullet I said is changing the human behavior in favor of renewable. So you can see again a triangle there. And in India, this is created by the Indian government, and that is this, that we want to achieve three things in this transition. One is it should be equitable, because we have a large number of people who are really, not maybe very small number is now left below the poverty line, but nevertheless, their affordability is very minimal. And so we want to have sustainability, and we want to have security, and we want to have equitability. So I think that all these things are needed. So where we are right now is not 100% in each area. We are more or less like, 60% that people can say. And this is not the chart that I have put it. This is the chart from the government of India. So now, what are the major issues in energy transition, and what are the initiatives that government is taking? So it's a very busy chart. I will just touch upon is that one is the production linked incentive, that is called the PLI, and that is that how do we basically make the provide the incentive. So the Indian government is taking the lead in that, and so they are investing a tremendous amount of money. So in the Indian rupees INR, they are investing about 15 billion rupees, which is a huge amount. And so they want to go from 65 gigawatt of capacity to achieve about 500 gigawatt of capacity by 2030. That is in about next 10 years. So there is an investment, and most of the investment is going towards the solar energy. And so the goal is that if they can achieve these goals, it will require an investment of 2.4 trillion rupees. So this is a huge investment required. So in that context, they are trying to connect with other countries, particularly the countries in the Gulf region, like United Emirates and so on. Now, energy conservation amendment is, again, which I have alluded to, is a good bill that Indian government is working on, and to address the issue of energy conservation. The clean energy plan is basically, based on the offshore wind, primarily from Gujarat and Tamil Nadu, and put it as a part of the national grid. And so that will again require about the cost of about 28 billion rupees. So these are all very costly endeavors, but at least there is an attempt, and very serious attempt, to move in this direction. Then, of course, India is taking a big leap, and I think that is where there is a lot of potential is in the area of green hydrogen. So green hydrogen is emission free actually, and there is a chance that India can become a leader actually in the area of generation of the green hydrogen. So my reading shows that that is going to be a really important area for Indian investment. And I think the government is aware of it. And so they are going in that particular direction. And of course, as I mentioned to you, that they are looking for the foreign direct investment, FDI. And in that, one of the things that I'm mentioning here is in 2023, that is last year, they created some kind of a agreement with Saudi Arabia and a memorandum of understanding for energy cooperation. And so also, of course, there is an energy cooperation that is going on with other countries, and there is a discussion going on with the United States and other countries in terms of the foreign direct investment to invest in the energy infrastructure in India. Now, what are the biggest biggest problems in achieving this transition is, of course, as I have already mentioned, is the financial burden of the outdated infrastructure. So Indian infrastructure is really outdated, and that means in the distribution infrastructures of electricity, the industrial infrastructures in the industrial plant, the equipment, and also the way the people are using, various appliances and so on. So there's a lot of problem in the infrastructure, and that requires a lot of investment to change. And of course, people have to be incentivized in order to do that. And then, of course, the financing the transition, as I already mentioned, will require a tremendous amount of money in order to make that possible. The other problem in India is the grid reliability. And that again is because the grid that is used in providing the needs, even in the far off places in India, which are still not electrified. Actually, there are areas which are still not electrified. So in order to do that, there's again a tremendous amount of investment is needed. And of course, in G20 summit, the India took a lead, and of course, India, Middle East, Europe, and they have decided to create an economic corridor now. How it will work and how it will take place, it is yet to be seen, because many times these alliances just remain a paper tiger, and do not really materialize. But hopefully, these things will materialize. So, and there are, of course, other alliances that are being looked at by the government. And so, like, the Biofuel Alliance, the Global Bioenergy Partnership, and all that. The whole idea here is that how do we basically invest and attract the investment, and also educate the public and the industry to make this transition possible, and also reach to the people where even we don't have electricity. And so that's where the issues like, grid installations, grid reliability comes into play, and the triangle that I showed you, the equitable distribution of the development in the country, should be allowed, should be made it feasible. So now you can see here that India is not doing that well, actually. If you look at the left-hand side, it says globally fourth position in overall renewable energy, which is really very remarkable. If you look at the wind capacity increased 2 times from 26 gigawatts to 42 gigawatts in last 10 years, which is remarkable. So India we should not, I think that the government that is in place in the last 10 to 15 years has done a remarkable achievement in this transition. So the renewable power generation increased 1.5 times from 196 BU to 291 since 2014. And it has a third renewable energy capacity addition of 63 gigawatt in last 5 years. So India has done, remarkable things in terms of, in last 10 years. And it is on a growth path, and not only in terms of the GDP, in terms of improving the overall quality of the people and addressing a lot of goals of the United Nations, which are very important for all kind of aspect of the life, of human life. It has done quite well, but you can see that they are all things are very positive. On the right hand side, if you look at again, that is relatively, future forecast also, that how much will be needed in terms of investment. But the solar power installed capacity increased 25 times. So that is where I think that India is putting the bet on, that is the solar power and the electric vehicle, in order to control the problem of emissions. So I think that India's emphasis on solar power, and particularly solar PV, and also the electric vehicles, I think is eventually going to have a big payoff. Not only it will enhance the economy, it will provide a lot of jobs, but also there is a future for even export in the future. And so there's a tremendous amount of growth potential. But I think my sense is studying the scenario in India that it has a tremendous potential in the future. So what is the investment scenario in 2021? So you can see here that, and what you see in the middle of these blue boxes is for every decade, they are talking about investment of like, for example, from this decade, it's going to be about $2.5 trillion in 10 years. And so that is about $0.25 trillion per year. And so in the next decade, $4.4 trillion. These are all forecasts. And going back to 50, it was only $5.5 trillion. So the India is expecting an investment about $12.7 trillion in the next 30 years, going from 2020 to 2050. Now, if you translate it in terms of the INR, it will be even 80 times a huge number. And so that will become 960 trillion INR. But again, all these things is feasible if there is a revenue that is being generated. And that means that the Indian economy continues to grow the way it has been growing, at least at the rate of at least 7 to 9%. Then these numbers will make sense. But if the economy for some reason or the other slows down, it will be difficult. So now you can see here in this chart that in energy supply and demand. So in energy supply and demand, to achieve the non-zero in next 30 years or close to non-zero in 2050. So what will be the overall situation? It will require investment about 30 trillion US dollars, and the various areas that it will be addressed. So one of the things that I had mentioned to you, the carbon capture and sequestration, they are thinking about investing about 6%, hydrogen 3%, and then the EV sales is the one that I told you is going to be the big thing, and that is the electric vehicles is 30%. And then you can see here that the sustainable materials, which are basically related to more solar PV as well. So you can see that overall scenario that the emphasis is going to be on electric vehicles, solar power, and also some other aspect of electric power with CCS using fossil fuels. Now the consumption by fuel, you can see in 2021, and the net zero scenario in 2050. It will increase, of course, because of the population growth also, from 25,000 petajoules to 36,000 petajoules. And again, you can see the mix will change. So what you see here, the coal is in 23% in 2021. And if you go to 2050, the coal will be only 12%, which is shown in blue. And so you can see the 28%, which is shown here, is the bioenergy, and that will reduce to 23%. And so 45% is the electricity, and so that will increase and go to about 19%. So you can see the change that will take place in terms of going to the net zero scenario from in next 30 years. And that is doable based on what I showed you before. So let me conclude, because I think I'm running a little bit over time, but I do want to conclude the overall scenario in India. And so I think the accelerating the energy transition could open several opportunities for India, creating millions of jobs, enhancing energy security, and tangibly reducing its greenhouse gas emissions. The global renewable energy sector employs about 11.5 million, and about 24 million new jobs will be estimated by 2030. So I think it's going to be a big thing. And I think the Indian government is on the right track, along with the participation of the public. Excuse me, India could take the lead internationally in green hydrogen, which I told you, which is the right emphasis actually for India in the area of green hydrogen. And renewable batteries, which I'm not personally not sure, because renewable batteries, a tremendous amount of work is going on, particularly in China and also in the United States and other parts of the world. But I am very gung-ho on the green hydrogen. I think green hydrogen, India has a tremendous potential to become a leader in the world. And now India can be a market for low carbon technologies at about USD of 80 billion. So India's energy sector would require on average US dollar of 160 billion annually from now to 2030. So investment, that is a foreign investment that is required, along with the Indian own revenues, will be equivalent to what US dollar about 160 billion to achieve what I have shown you before, and to achieve the non-zero emission by 2070. And the total amount will be in about 12.5 trillion that I mentioned to you before. But it is feasible because I think that the country is on the right track. But I am, of course, a distant observer. I am just making these statements, having a very limited knowledge of it, which I acquired only, I would say, in last month or so, to the level that I have after the Shubhangi told me to prepare a lecture. So I looked into it, and then I actually spent some time on it. But because of the lack of time, I cannot go into more detail. But I think that my summary is that what I have told you, that the energy transition is in India is on a very good track, and the present government, and I hope that it continues, even if with the change of government on this track. And so the final conclusion of my talk is that sustainable future for all mankind with clean environment, health, education, decent livelihood, and free of violence is not possible under the present dependence on fossil fuels as primary source of energy. Therefore, a political will is needed for immediate shift and investment in the scientific and technological development. And my own take on this is that I think the political will is being generated in almost all the countries in the world. The problem is basically that was pointed out by Sherry Rahman and also other countries like India and African countries, including China, that we have not been a polluters because we were never allowed to develop to the degree that the Western nations who became polluters by using coal and other sources and had such a affluence. So now, since we are together in this crisis, which is giving rise to these problems of extreme weather events and the future of humanity is at stake, there has to be some degree of care and concern on the part of the wealthier nations to provide resources for the infrastructure investment in the energy transition. And that estimates have been made, and the money is there, but there has to be a political will to make that infrastructure investment in the poorer or relatively poorer nations feasible. And in the end, everybody will be a winner, because once these economies become better, because of the investment, there will be job creation, and also the ultimate outcome will be good for the whole humanity. But whether that political will is there at a country level, I think the political will is there now, including in India and the United States and other countries. But I think the problem is that the will to consider everybody to be a part of the global humanity, I think it has to require a lot more work to generate that. And that has not seemed to have happened right now. Although I think there is some movement that is taking place since COP27. And so I will conclude it with the famous quote from by Mahatma Gandhi, and that is the world has enough for everyone's needs, but not enough for everyone's greed. If you multiply individual production millions of times, would it not give you mass production on tremendous scale? I conclude my talk here. Thank you for your attention. So I am done with my talk.
Yes, audience, any question?
Yes, I have a question. So, can you tell what geopolitical shifts might occur as countries transition to renewable energy sources? For example, what will happen to the oil-dependent economies?
Yeah, so that is what I am saying, and I showed you some charts that currently most of the economies are dependent on oil. For transportation, for example, for some industrial usage, for sometimes for heating also. And so oil, coal, and natural gas, these are the three fossil fuels, not only India, but almost all countries. The economies are highly dependent on these three major traditional sources of energy. So as you are going to transition it, the question comes in that certainly there are a large number of people employed in it, and it is being used by industry and also for everyday energy needs. So you will have to have a gradual transition. You cannot tomorrow say, okay, first of all, you don't have alternative sources. So you have to have alternative sources where you can without having an economic catastrophe, you can use those alternative sources. You can use the alternative sources only in a gradual way. So if suppose wind power becomes available, and you can put it in, say, in the grid, solar power becomes available, you have to put into the grid. And of course, there are technical issues involved there, and because these are intermittent sources of power, they are not continuous sources of power. So you have to take care of all these issues, but this transition is going to take place over a period of 40 years, 50 years. And what will happen is that even if the oil is there, even if the coal is there, it will remain there, but you don't need it because you have transitioned to the sources which are available. For example, sun is in plenty. Sun is not going to disappear. It is going to be always there. Wind is going to be always there. May not be as much wind as you need, but like, for example, for Indian scenario, sun will always be there, right? And so as a result of that, but we have not used the sun. We have not used the sun as a source of energy. Now, before the modern civilization came, the people used to use the sun. They will take a pot of water and put it in the sun, and then they have hot water available. So, going way back centuries ago. So that transition will take place slowly so that the economic impact is not there. Now, you don't have to completely get out of the coal or natural gas. You can still have coal power plant. You can still have natural gas run power plant. But if they are being used in a fixed area, fixed place, they are not a transportation fuel. Transportation fuel, as I told you, has a mobile emissions. So if you have a fixed place, then you can capture the CO2, and then you can figure out a way how to use it. Either you can turn it into some useful chemicals, or you can sequester. The technology is there. It is the cost that you have to consider. So that will take place. If you look at the scenario that I presented to you in India itself, if there will be investment of $12.4 trillion in next 30 years, this transition will take place in a fashion that people will not be impacted highly. The people who are working in the coal mines, they will not lose their job. So that is the job of the government, so that the transition is taking place and the mix of all the energy sources remains, and they are made as clean as possible. But it cannot happen overnight, because if it happens overnight, it will completely create a total disruption in the current scenario, which is not going to be possible. You are talking about it will create economic revolution in the country, and that is not possible. Any other question?
Sir, I had a question. What about what specific technological advancements or innovations do you believe will be critical in accelerating the transition to a net zero energy in the near future?
Yeah, so Bharti, could you slowly say it again? I could not completely follow your question.
Yes, sir. What specific technological advancements or innovations do you believe will be critical in accelerating the transition to a net zero future and energy in the near future?
So I told you that the transition that is going to take place is that how do we create infrastructure for the renewables, which means that, for example, we have plenty of sun in major parts of the country. How do we harness the energy from the sun to create a energy need that we have? So the solar power, for example, or solar panels or solar photovoltaic, if we can install, for example, on a lot of our homes, or we can create even solar farm, for example, which has photovoltaic sources. Now, there are photovoltaic panels. From there, then we can get the energy and feed it into a grid, the power lines. And also, since it is an intermittent source of energy, we can have a storage system like a battery or some other storage system. So all these technologies, like storage technologies, the photovoltaic panels, they all can be together along with the grid in which you can, or a power grid in which you can feed the energy. So these are the technologies that will be needed. So similarly, wind energy. So how do you harness the wind energy? You need a wind turbine. So just like harnessing the hydropower, what do you need? You need a hydro turbine. So those are the technologies that you will need to get the wind energy. So the technology is there. It's not that people have already generated these technologies. The question is that how do you now use those technologies, which means that how do you make an investment in those technologies, which means it will require some money to invest, and then you can do that. So, or of course, at a later stage, once you become comfortable with it, you can have your own innovation. And if you have your own innovation, then you can actually make it more cheaper, much more effective in terms of efficiency. So all these things will fall in place once you have a plan that how do you want to now harness those sources of technologies which you have not done that so far. So that is the plan for every country.
Thank you, sir.
I have one question.
Yes.
Thus keeping a lockdown once in a month can help save ozone layer on reduction of pollution, like it did during COVID-19. If so, then why it is not implemented yet?
Now, Priyanshu, again, could you please slowly tell me again what your question is?
Thus, keeping a lockdown once in a month can help save ozone layer on reducing the pollution, like it did in COVID-19. If so, then why it was not implemented?
Okay, so the ozone layer actually has been affected only in a certain part of the world, and primarily there has been a problem over Australia or in that part of the world. So the ozone layer problem is now under control. I think that has been handled. That problem has been known for about more than 50 or maybe more 70, 80 years. And so once they found that the ozone layer problem is there, it has been addressed to some degree. So the level of pollution that we have right now, in terms of the greenhouse gases, that is the percentage of CO2, which is about 400 part per million. Methane is really very small, is about 316 part per billion, is such that, and is a distribution, that ozone problem is not there. Now, you related something about COVID. So I do not understand. You said that because of COVID, it was not implemented. I could not really follow, how does it relate to the COVID and the ozone problem?
Sir, I posted the question on the chat.
Did I answer your question? Okay, any more questions?
Bharti, now you can propose vote of thanks.
Thank you very much. It's been an honor to be a part of this session, and I'd like to extend my gratitude to everyone involved. First and foremost, I'd like to express my heartfelt appreciation to our distinguished speaker, Dr. Ramesh Agrawal. Your insights have been invaluable, and your dedication to innovation is truly inspiring. I also want to thank Amog Nagarkar for his eloquent introduction, which set the perfect tone for today's discussion. Your words painted a vivid picture of Professor Agarwal's journey and accomplishments, and we are grateful for your contribution to this event. To our esteemed guests and colleagues, thank you for your active participation and engagement throughout the session. Your thoughtful questions and contributions have enriched our dialogue and made this event truly memorable. Last but not least, I'd like to thank the organizers and everyone behind the scenes who worked tirelessly to make this event possible. Your hard work and dedication are deeply appreciated. In closing, let's carry forward the insights and inspiration gained from today's session as we continue to explore new frontiers in technology and innovation. Thank you once again to everyone involved, and I look forward to our paths crossing again in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I appreciate this opportunity to talk to all of you. I know that, there were good attendance. There were 60 people, and all of you probably, I hope, got something useful out of this lecture. And I'm sure that in the way the things are moving, in my judgment, whatever I know, the India will become really on a much more a bigger player in terms of energy transition. And if the government plans, are all successful, then it will be able to achieve the goal of net zero by 2070. And if not by 2070, maybe by 2080 or 2090. But the investment that is taking place, at least whatever I have read, is going to be, in the right way, emphasizing the right strength, both technical strength and also the economic strength and political strength of India at this stage. And it's playing, bigger and bigger role in the world affairs. So, I'm really thankful to you to provide me this opportunity to talk to all of you about this subject. And I do admit that actually I learned myself in a lot in putting this presentation together, particularly about the Indian scenario, because I did take some time to understand, what is the situation and in which direction India is going. So it has been very helpful. And also, I just read in the chat box that, the Priyanshu was actually asking a question about COVID, that during COVID, the pollution decreased. So, that is a kind of situation that, since people did not drive that much, and, they did not engage in the, a lot of things that they were doing before, in terms of the usage of particularly transportation, the skies became more clear. And it is well known, the pollution, like for example, in a major metropolitan area of Delhi and Bombay and all that, reduced because people were not driving. They were basically working from home and using Zoom. And so, but that is a temporary situation that occurred. We have to recognize that what is a everyday affair. And you cannot also isolate itself, because there was a lot of negative effects that happened to the people's health, people's social life, people's interactions because of COVID. COVID was a pandemic, which we hope such a situation never occurs, because it took away a lot of lives of people, created a lot of concern, big pressure on the health system. And so saying that the COVID, resulted into, some less pollution on major metropolitan areas because people were not driving, that is not a solution. But certainly one thing we can learn, that drive less unless you need it. So if you have a mass transit system, that you take the metro in Delhi, just don't go and drive. Or you, unless until it is necessary to drive someplace, go on a bicycle. It is good for your health also. So these are all the alternative things that one can think, which came out of also a learning curve from the COVID. But the COVID itself was not something that had a positive overall outcome. So anyway, I understood your question now, in the chat box. So again, I want to thank all of you to attend my talk. And then particularly, I want to thank Shubhangi Ratkantiwar for inviting me, and I enjoyed this discussion.
Thank you so much, sir, for accepting our invitation and making this presentation so nicely. Very wonderful session, sir.
So should I sign off?
Yes, sir. Thank you again.
Okay, very good. All right. So I will leave the Zoom.
Dear participants, tomorrow's session will be conducted by Dr. Deepak Vaikar from Singapore, and he will also talk on renewable energy, green energy, and global warming. So please attend Deepak Vaikar sir's session at 12:30. Meeting is over now. You